Welcome everyone to Walpole's weekly webinar. I'm Helen Brocklebank, I'm Walpole's CEO, and this time last year, and actually usually at this time of year, every year, Charlotte Keesing and I and Michael Ward, chairman of Walpole, and lots of Walpole members would be in New York for our annual trade and media mission to British luxury's most important market. Of course, pre-pandemic, the US accounted for nearly a quarter of British luxury's exports, and affluent American visitors to the UK were a hugely important part of the high-end economy here in the UK itself. So, well, you know, as we all know, 2020 is a very different year, and in the US, that's got a super extra complication because they're the hotly contested, high-octane, high-stakes US election is kind of less than it's only a fortnight away. Less than a fortnight away, in fact. So last night in Pennsylvania, I don't know if any of you caught Barack Obama giving a very powerful speech for his Democratic candidate, Joe Biden. And what he said really struck me was he said, "I've sat in the Oval Office with both of the men running for the presidency." So both men running for president. And let me tell you, he said, they are very different men. I mean, what understatement there, isn't that the truth? So to give us the inside track on what's happening with the election, what the implications are for the markets, what the fallout will be for British luxury, what we can expect, and hopefully some of the colour that we have learned to expect coming from over the ocean. Let me welcome our guests. We have the economist Daniel Franklin, a huge friend of Walpole, and Hanover Communications, Larry Smith, and Andre Kazaki from British American Business. And of course, in the chair, as ever, is the brilliant Charlotte Keesing. Welcome, and over to you, Charlotte.
Oh, thanks so much, Helen, and thank you for the lovely kind words. Andre, Larry, and Daniel, could you all turn on your microphones and your cameras, please? Terrific. Thank you very much, and good to have you with us this afternoon. I couldn't think of a better panel to be talking about the topics ahead of us today. I thought we'd try to kind of cover 3 or 4 areas in our discussion. We've only got 45 minutes, and obviously this is a topic that could go on for days, and of course is already going on for days. But I thought perhaps we could firstly just cover off and talk about the elections, the campaigns, the polls, and what this might mean in terms of a Biden presidency or a Trump presidency administration, then talk a bit about the UK and US trade talks and potential trade deal, and then drill down into a couple of very, more detailed topics that are particularly relevant for our sector around the Boeing Airbus trade dispute and also the digital services tax, two pieces of policy that are quite a priority for our members because of the fallout in terms of tariffs. So if that would just frame our conversation for the next kind of 45 minutes. So please, if you have any questions, do send them in on the chat function. They will come up and then we'll answer those either in order as they come or at the end, depending on the flow of the conversation. And please do message. It's great to hear from the audience, which obviously we can't do when we're normally in kind of a physical event. So please do be in touch and ask questions. Firstly, so we're 2 weeks away now, under 2 weeks, aren't we now? Actually, both campaigns are giving it their all. As Helen said, we saw kind of a searing, a blistering account from Obama last night on his successor's tenure and straying away from that tradition of former presidents not criticising their successors. But where are we now? Well, what are the polls saying today, and what are the predictions from that kind of inner circle, those people that you work with and all deal with? I'm going to actually maybe come to you first for that, Daniel, if I may, and then over to you, Larry.
Well, thank you, Charlotte, and thanks very much for having me on this. It is a fascinating time. As you say, we really are in the final stretch now. It's been exhausting to follow it, at least from afar. So we have one of the big final set piece events of the campaign tonight, which is the second and final debate. There were meant to be 3, but as you know, the second of the 3 didn't happen because Trump refused to take part. I think one of the things that's been perhaps a little bit surprising is how stable the polls have been through all the fury of the campaign. so something pretty dramatic has to happen in these final 12 days. And tonight is one of those opportunities for something dramatic to happen, to change the picture. And the person who will be wanting that something dramatic happens is, of course, Donald Trump, because what the polls show is not only a very clear lead for Joe Biden in the popular vote, but a clear electoral college win. If even in the swing states, Biden is doing pretty well in the majority of them, although it's closer in the swing states. So our economist has had a forecasting model, a brave thing to do in American elections,
Yeah.
but it is showing something like a 9 in 10 chance of Biden winning the electoral college, not just the popular vote. Everybody, I think, thinks the popular vote will go to Biden. That's not what matters, as we saw very clearly last time. It's the electoral college that matters. Mm-hmm. So the odds are very clearly on Biden for the moment. That said, as we all learned from last time, and there's a big nervousness about being too certain because so many people got it wrong last time, a lot can shift towards the end, and the momentum can swing. Bear in mind two things, though, I would just say, and then I'll hand over to the others for the. One is that already about 40 million Americans have voted, so quite a lot of it is already baked in. People have cast their votes in advance in postal ballots. The second is that the vote itself, the result may not be the end of the story. As we know, Trump is highly likely to contest this if he doesn't win, particularly if it's close. So there could be a very contested and difficult time even after November the 3rd.
Yeah, so great. But then we'll come back to the potential of the vote being contested, because I think it's a good point to explore. Larry, what's your view with
Yeah, I agree with Daniel there. I think an interesting point to pick up on there is why have these polls been so stable going back to a year or so ago? Why has Biden remained so far ahead even before COVID hit? And I think there's quite a profound problem for Trump and the Republican Party here, which is the degree to which university-educated white voters and white women in particular have deserted the Republican Party over the last couple of years. Biden looks like he'll be the first Democrat in a long time to win white educated voters by double digits. The gender gap may stretch to about 30 points, which is extraordinary. And I think a lot of that is tied up with how these particular white voters view questions of identity. I think right from when Trump was elected, these white voters have become more conscious about systemic problems in race and gender relations. And things that have happened since then, going back to things like the Brett Kavanaugh hearing, for example, then more recently the Black Lives Matter protests, it's only kind of pushed them further and further away from the Republican coalition. So some of the things the Republican Party was worried about in 2012 and 2013 when Mitt Romney lost have really kind of come to fruition despite Trump's win in 2016. I think Trump is still likely to be able to rally a significant amount of non-university educated white voters to his side, especially in states like Florida and Georgia, where the loyalty to the Republican Party is a lot stronger. He may also do a little bit better with non-white men, particularly non-white Latino men, who are kind of turned off by a lot of what we might call woke politics. So it's not a done deal for Biden, but to kind of bottom out a little bit more about what Daniel was saying there about the battleground polls and the state polls, if you dig a little deeper into polling that's done of congressional seats, so seats that are up in the House of Representatives, and even further down into county elections, it's looking really quite dire for the Republican Party. So in districts in places like suburban Detroit in Michigan, which Trump won very narrow last time, suburban Philadelphia and Pennsylvania, where Trump won by a very narrow margin, and then even into what were traditionally Republican states like Arizona, suburban Phoenix, suburban parts of Texas, the bottom really does seem to be falling out of the Republican Party's coalition there, and they're going to have to make up a lot of ground in more rural areas or more non-college educated areas if they're going to turn back that tide. So then the path is narrow for Trump, in my view.
Interesting. Thank you. And that kind of dipping down to the kind of the sway of the different voting groups, absolutely. And Andrew, British American Council, you're sitting there championing trade on both sides of the Atlantic and supporting business operations between the two. What's the view from British American business?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I agree with pretty much everything that Daniel and Larry have said so far. Probably the only thing that I would say, and it's something that I do enjoy repeating and getting into arguments with over, is the fact that the polls in 2016, the national polls were largely right. What we did get kind of wrong were a few state level polls. And those seem to have been corrected. There's been a substantial sort of adjustment by the pollsters, and sort of waiting for things like education, which Larry mentioned. So I would have a bit more faith in the polls this time around. But again, I share everyone's reluctance about making predictions. Something one of the funny things about someone having a 25% chance of winning is that a 1 in 4 chance actually happens quite often. So yeah, not in the business of making predictions this year either. So in terms of the mood, I would say, and this is maybe a more of a personal observation, that something from BAB is that after all these 4 years, I wouldn't underestimate the appetite of the American people for a presidency that sort of can run in the background and can be boring. And again, I'm not really an expert on this, but it's just something that I've observed from conversations with friends across the pond.
I think that's a great point. Certainly less turbulence would be attractive for all of us, I suspect. And Daniel, you picked up on a great point there around what would happen if the results were contested. I mean, how actually would that play out? What would the process be? What would the impact of that be? Could you just share a few thoughts on that?
Well, it would be, first of all, of course, full of tweets. But also it would be being America full of lawyers, and ultimately, if it was really close, as it did in 2000, it would go all the way to the Supreme Court. I think it all depends a little bit on how close it is. If it's really not that close, but Trump is still arguing with the result, I think you would then start to see Republicans slipping away from him, fellow Republicans, and wondering whether they really want to attach themselves to that particular crusade. So I think it has to be reasonably close for that to keep the uncertainty going. And we'll see. I mean, if there's going to be a landslide, it will be a Biden landslide rather than a Trump landslide. It'll be either the two extremes are quite a narrow Trump victory or a Biden landslide, and points in between are possible. One other thing perhaps to mention is that we haven't really talked, I think Larry mentioned going sort of deep down into local areas. Of course, Senate and House races matter hugely too, and whether the Senate goes to flips to the Democrats could be, it's not just a question of potentially Biden winning, but does he have the backing of all of Congress to really be quite a president who can actually get things done rather than just relying on executive orders. Yes,
great point. Anything to add there, Larry and Andre, on that?
I think just to say on the Supreme Court, it's quite interesting. There's been a number of cases that have gone up to the Supreme Court in the last few weeks concerning ballots and extension of voting times and that sort of thing. And we have seen this court, which is even more conservative after the death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, be quite indifferent to attempts to extend voting or take a very liberal approach to ballots. But one thing we're also seeing, and there was an interesting judgment out of South Carolina recently, is that certainly Brett Kavanaugh and John Roberts, both of whom were actually involved in the 2000 recount, seem more reluctant than their even more conservative colleagues to really put their finger on the scale for the Republican Party. I think they are very mindful of what happened in 2000. They are very mindful about the potential implications for the legitimacy of the court if it were to again be seen to be putting a thumb on the scale. And I think people may be underestimating a little bit the differences in opinion between conservative justices. And I think some of them will be quite reluctant to be seen to be rubber stamping a win for Trump, essentially.
Thank you. Andre?
Nothing really to add. I think those were excellent points.
Terrific, thank you. And what about what's the response been from the markets as well? Perhaps to you first, Daniel, with a view from the Economist.
I think markets want stability. That's what they want. They want predictability. So the worst result for the markets would be a contested election. And the market, there's been a certain amount of pricing in of Biden victory, I think.
Yes.
so if that doesn't happen, I expect there'll be quite a lot of volatility again. But you know, the markets would be, I think, happy either way, so long as they can have a no result.
Yes, and avoid a contest. And thinking about COVID as well, I mean, it's obviously dominated the campaigns and the elections and all of our lives, hasn't it? You know, what extent is it going to influence the decision of the outcome? Do you have a thought? Maybe Andre first.
Again, a layman's opinion here, because I'm not an expert. I think it has definitely changed the course of, at least in the polls. I would have been a lot more skeptical about a Biden win, sort of in December or January than I am right now. So I think it kind of accelerated some trends and some sort of public opinion shifts.
Yeah, would you agree with that, Larry?
Yeah, I think actually one of the really interesting trends that COVID has thrown up is the tensions between federal, state and local governments and how that kind of plays out politically. So in what were these very traditional Republican states like Arizona and Georgia and Texas, there have been some really sharp clashes between the Republican governors and Democratic city leaders over social distancing rules, mask mandates, and some really heavy-handed moves by those governors to pull the power away from those mayors. I think in Georgia, the Republican governor even tried to stop the mayor of Atlanta from speaking about the issue, which was pretty crazy. I think those things have just really stirred up anger among people living in metro areas, people living in suburban areas, pushing suburban voters away from their rural counterparts towards city people. So I think it's potentially accelerating the move of those states into the purple column, as it were. I think that's almost the biggest trend to watch out for.
Thank you. Dan, if I can come back to you, and forgive me, this is a huge question, so apologies up front that it's such a massive question. But you so elegantly always summarise things brilliantly. What's going to be here? Well, could you summarise the kind of global and geopolitical implications of a Trump presidency or a Biden presidency? Sorry, a big question.
Yeah, well, I mean, very broadly, I think if Trump has a second term, I think it will be incredibly mind concentrating particularly for America's allies. They will have to start thinking, well, this wasn't just a blip. This was something America really means it. We have to fundamentally rethink alliances. We have to rethink European defense. We have to wonder who's actually going to lead the world, because we don't think America wants that job anymore. If it's Biden, I think it'd be much more mixed. I think it'd be perhaps a big sigh of relief amongst allies, thinking, okay, we have an America that's going to believe in taking a leadership role, believe in alliances fundamentally, think that in taking on China, which is after all the really big thing, that America's strength is precisely that it can double its weight in the world thanks to its allies both in Europe and in Asia. But it won't be be mistaken to believe that you're just putting the clock back to the world before Trump. The world has changed fundamentally, and America is going to be much more focused on China, is going to expect much more from its allies, and it's a much less comfortable world in the future anyway. But I think nevertheless they will feel a greater degree of familiarity with the America that would be under Biden than is under Trump.
Yes, that perfectly summarised. And actually, thinking about China, what's the Chinese view of Trump? Is it different to perhaps what the European view is?
Well, I think they probably feel they did a trade deal with him, so to some extent they feel they can do business with him. But it's been an awkward relationship, and I don't think they like the unpredictability greatly either. They also, I think, see advantages for them to advance as America retreats from its role in leading, particularly the multilateral system. So you see that in places like United Nations. You see it dramatically with the World Health Organization, where you have America withdrawing and China moving forward. You see it on climate, where America dropped out of the Paris Agreement and China makes at least in rhetorically big commitments. So I think on that front, they've taken the Trump administration and the America First withdrawal from the sort of internationalist role as a chance for China to impose itself more in the wider world.
Increasing dominance. Andre, what would your view be on what this might mean in terms of kind of the global impact and the geopolitical impact of either presidency?
Yeah, I mean, again, kind of more or less in full agreement with Daniel. I think I would add, when it comes to transatlantic relations, that we will probably see a change in tone and approach towards allies, but I think the main direction of US foreign policy and trade policy, it will still kind of be there. I don't think, for example, a Biden administration would drop pressure on NATO allies to commit to the 2% GDP spending for defense. So, when it comes to sort of U.S. partners reassessing sort of global relations, I think that's already a process that's been taking place. And yeah, I think Europe shouldn't be comfortable with the fact that Biden might win, just because I don't think it will change fundamentally things for them. Things like the WTO dispute will still remain to be resolved, and that's a very big question mark as to how that will be resolved. We've heard Europe, the EU has received approval from the WTO to impose tariffs on the US for in relation to the Boeing case. They said they want a negotiated settlement, but we don't yet know what that will mean or if that will be the case at all. So big question mark. I think, like I said, change in approach from the US if Biden wins, but not fundamentally a change in direction.
Yeah, interesting. And Larry, what's your view?
Yeah, I think I might kind of have a slightly different view of this, which is that I think the Biden team have, I think, what one expert's called a kind of reformationist approach to foreign policy. A lot of Democrats around Biden have gone away and done a bit of thinking since Obama left office. I think Daniel's right there. They're going to be a bit more hawkish on China. I think that they don't really see their job as now upholding the liberal international order so much as bringing the free world together to push back against authoritarianism and to defend democracy. And in that kind of view of the world, in a way, I think the Western allies will find things that are perhaps a little bit easier than we might think. I think, for example, the 2% defense spending target might get a little bit less play. They'll be more interested in what other countries can do in other areas, for example, cybersecurity as part of NATO. And I think where you will see the Biden administration take a much firmer stance than the Obama administration did is when it comes to allies in other areas. So, for example, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Turkey, Hungary. There's been some pretty vicious commentary from Biden and other people beneath him about Saudi Arabia. I certainly think that the withdrawal of support for Saudi intervention in Yemen is on the table. There's even been some talk about potential sanctions from America on Saudi on Turkey. I think that probably goes too far, largely because of how the UAE and Qatar still have good relationships with the US. But I think it's there where I think we will see quite a break with what both Obama and Trump have done before.
Yeah. Thank you. I'm making notes as we go. And what about thinking about the UK-US trade relationship? Obviously, always talked about as the special relationship, and certainly from a luxury goods perspective, the US is one of our biggest export markets, as Helen said. But also, an American customer really does, kind of have a great affinity and love for British luxury. The associations with kind of monarchy, aristocracy, that the heritage all resonates incredibly well. So, thinking about our member businesses, the trade talks are certainly kind of a priority and very important. What's the impact of the elections going to be on those trade talks? Obviously, at the start of the year, there's this huge commitment to get a trade deal done as quickly as possible ahead of the elections. That's obviously, not going to happen. So, kind of where are we now? Andre, I know you're working a lot on this at British American Business.
Yeah, it's complicated. I think that would be my short answer. The long answer would be that, so trade agreements in general take years to negotiate. This one has had about, I think, 6 months or so, something like that. So we're in the middle of the 5th round of negotiations right now. So it's not been a very long time, but the two sides have engaged in about 2 years worth of informal talks before the formal talks were kicked off. So there is that advantage to them. Right now, both sides seem very much committed to it, and I think we've heard from Ambassador Lighthizer just this week about sort of reinforcing that commitment to getting a deal. But of course, the elections are a very big question mark, and you could imagine that an incoming Biden administration would have very different priorities, would put a lot of emphasis on domestic policy first and foremost, and this is not sort of reading the stars. It's he's been very explicit about it. So yeah, I mean the transatlantic business community continues to push for a deal to be done and for the progress that has been made over the past year to not be lost, and I think that is very much possible. We've seen previous and sort of with previous trade deals, we've seen sort of progress that was made by one administration being picked up by the incoming one and getting something done. That said, either way, it's not going to be easy. There is a very big milestone in 2021, in July 2021, which is the Trade Promotion Authority, which is a piece of legislation which governs how Congress and the White House go into the trade negotiations and what legislation needs to be changed for an FTA to become law. So, and that's like I said, that needs that will expire in July 2021. It's uncertain right now whether it would be renewed or completely renegotiated. If it's completely renegotiated, we don't really know what form it will take, what new provisions it might contain. So it is going back to what Daniel and Larry were alluding to earlier. It also goes back to the Senate races and the House races, and how sort of Congress will play with the White House next year. So hopefully, we might see a lot of progress done by then, and then we'll get some kind of a trade agreement in due time. But the path is fairly narrow.
Great, thank you. And Larry, what's your view of how closely are kind of Hanover working on this or involved?
Yeah, we continue to follow it very closely. I think that people shouldn't kind of lose sight of the impact of a potential transition on the negotiations. So if Trump loses, there is a lot of speculation that he's going to make that transition from a Trump administration to a Biden administration very difficult, throw obstacles in the way of a new administration. I suspect that is true in other policy areas, including COVID, but on the UK trade deal, I suspect it's more likely that the White House and the Commerce Department under Secretary Ross just end up being quite disengaged. That could cut two ways. It could grind the talks to a halt and make really no political will to move things forward, but it could also create some space for the trade representative to move forward on smaller ticket items, such as the small business trade chapter, with a view to then handing those things over to the Biden administration in January. And that would be much more in keeping with previous transitions we've seen, for example, from Bush to Obama, when the Bush administration worked actually very hard to hand TARP and the auto bailout over to the Obama administration in good shape.
Yeah, it's a good point. And Daniel, what's your view?
Well, I'm not nearly as close to it as the coalface as Larry and Andre, but I would say that don't hold your breath, I would say, if it's a Biden administration, because I don't think it will be a priority for them. And these things are, as Andre said, really complicated. And on top of that, I think there's an awkwardness that has to be got over in the relationship between Britain and America if there is a Biden administration, which is that the Johnson government put rather a lot of investment into the Trump White House, shall we say, and has a bit of unfortunate history with the Obama administration in Boris Johnson's case. So I think there will be subtle efforts by an incoming Biden administration to give little snubs to Britain. I mean, the relationship is very deep. It's very, not just in luxury, but in all sorts of areas, militarily, in intelligence and so on. So it will survive merrily, but watch carefully the choreography of the early visits of Biden, visits to the White House. See who gets in first. Will it be Boris or Macron? When will Biden go to, might Biden stop by Ireland? Already we've seen a huge warning sign with the, it does depend a bit on what happens with the Brexit deal, that if there's a problem in the Anglo-Irish agreement, then there's going to be no trade deal. And we've heard that very clearly, both from Nancy Pelosi and from Joe Biden. So I think the warning signs have been there. I think there'll be a little bit of difficulty to get over with a new Biden administration.
I think that are brilliant answers from you all there, and actually that's a kind of a good point. Is in terms of Brexit, and obviously some positive news today that negotiations talks are back on and resuming after a lot of kind of media profile around it. And what's the impact of Brexit going to be here on our UK-US relationship? Obviously, Ireland, of course, and the border is a huge one. Anything else that we need to get on the radar? Perhaps to you, Andrew, first.
Sure. I think the short answer would be we need a deal. I think that is kind of what we're hearing from our members and from our companies, is that we need some kind of certainty and clarity over the future trade relationship between the UK and the EU. So hopefully we'll get some kind of clarity there. Probably, well, most likely this will not go away whichever way this goes this year. So it will be a very long process of defining the relationship between the UK and the EU over the next couple of years or more. So in terms of how that affects the negotiations, I think some voices have said that the US will wait to see what the UK agrees with the EU. I'm not entirely sure that that's kind of a red line, or they would be waiting just for that. But like, I think the implementation of the withdrawal agreement and sort of respecting the Good Friday Agreement will be very, very important for Democrats, and it seems to be a bipartisan issue in Congress. I think in general, transatlantic companies operating in the UK would just like a bit more clarity over the future regime with the EU. So that will be very important for pretty much any company.
Yes, agreed. As would we all. It seems extraordinary that we're under 10 weeks away from the end of the transition period, and still no deal in place yet. But there does seem to be commitment, doesn't there? And certainly what we hear is that there will be some kind of deal in regards to tariffs, at least, and free trade, well, maybe not services. And a question to come on to, actually, sorry, a question that's come in from one of the live chat is, will there be an impact sorry, forgive me, let me do the question better. What if we have a no-deal Brexit? What happens then? Dread to think of that, certainly from our industry's perspective. Larry, do you have a view on that?
Well, I think I just echo what's already been said. I think that it will be up to Britain to show that it can fulfil the obligations of the withdrawal agreement, that it can preserve the Good Friday Agreement, and that it can move forward to some kind of agreement with the EU. I don't think anything actually really kind of changes on that score. I think there's question about Britain's credibility, Britain's soft power, how Britain is perceived in the world. I mean, I actually think the relationship between the US and the UK under the radar has gone in a very bad direction over the past 5 years or so. I think Britain is seen in quite a low light across the aisle, really, and there have been all these disputes over, for example, how to handle the Middle East, how to handle intelligence. I really don't think it can almost get much worse in some respects. So I think no deal will just kind of compound a lot of the problems the UK already has. That said, I mean, just to kind of pick up a little bit on what Daniel was saying, I do think there are maybe one or two areas where the UK can try and push this conversation beyond Brexit and beyond, busts of Churchill and all this stuff. I think, for one thing, Boris Johnson's got a more kind of economically left-wing view of economic foreign policy, more so than David Cameron and Theresa May, that chimes with how people around Biden think about the global economy. I think that the Johnson administration has shown in the last couple of months that it's prepared to get on board with the idea of defending the free world against anti-liberal forces, Hong Kong, Huawei, protests in Belarus. And the Biden administration is going to want to show its green credentials, as has already been said, post-Trump, and the UK has a golden opportunity in COP26 and the G7 to offer the US a way of showing it's back in the global community. And I'm not sure that perhaps this is getting talked about a lot at the moment because the focus is all on the personalities, but I do think that people in the British government have thought about this, and that there will be some substantive things to offer the Biden administration if it wants to.
Yeah, brilliant point, actually. Terrific point. Something that you touched on earlier, Angela, I wanted to come to talk about, because it's a big priority for a lot of our members, because they are sadly collateral victims in the Boeing Airbus trade dispute, and currently there is 25% additional import duties on wool, cashmere, linen, whiskey goods into the US, and that's been in place for nearly a year now, actually. And we've seen, if I'm correct, we've seen that the EU have now been awarded their retaliatory tariffs, and we've then seen a response from, if I'm correct, from the US, that if Airbus repay the millions in aid to governments, that they would kind of end the feud, which I don't think is getting much support, is it? And there's now an EU conference planned for 26th of October to go and look at that list of goods that will be the goods that the EU will impose tariffs on. What's the latest, and are you quite close to this? Then, are you working on this quite closely?
Indeed, we've been following it very closely, and it's been a bit of a mixed year, in that we were very happy that products like shortbread or sort of were taken off, or gin wasn't added to the list of retaliatory tariffs by the USTR. But we continue to see, sort of like you said, tariffs on whiskey, on cashmere, on wool, all these products. All industries which are unrelated to the original dispute, and
Yes.
we'll continue to sort of advocate on behalf of our members who do this, who sort of are in these sectors. But it is a very tricky one, and I think personally, I think the fact that the UK has left the EU kind of adds another dimension to an already complex issue, which is that obviously this dispute involves the Airbus consortium countries. The UK will continue to be part of that, but it will no longer be part of the EU. So we will continue to stay close on this, and hopefully we'll get what the EU referred to as a negotiated settlement, because sort of a continuous back and forth and sort of carousel where we don't know what products would be added every 6 months or so. I think that is definitely not an ideal situation, to put it mildly.
So certainly looking from a luxury goods perspective on that kind of Annex 2, we've got handbags, sparkling wine, glassware, china and porcelainware, and then on that kind of tariff, I think it's the Annex 3 has then got British gins as well. A huge potential impact on our member businesses, and incredibly difficult for businesses that are trying to grow their US operations in that climate. Larry, any thoughts from you? Are you working on that at all, or not really something that Hannah are involved in?
So Hanover actually does work with Airbus, so I will stay out of the yes. specifics on that one. I just make the point. Yeah, I mean, Biden's senior foreign policy aide, Antony Blinken, told the US Chamber of Commerce last month that the Democrats want to end what he called artificial trade wars as soon as possible. Lord Darroch, who was our ambassador to the US, he was just on a webinar we were running earlier, and he said he thought this dispute could be kind of swept up as part of an early visit by Biden to Europe, in which he would also, reaffirm Article 5 and do various other things. So I think the only thing I'd add is just watch for kind of a big bang moment where Biden tries to reset a whole range of things, and that trade is part of that.
Yeah, and certainly from all of our member businesses, it would be a big sigh of relief if we could get to some conclusion on it. Definitely. Another high priority for member businesses is the taxation on digital businesses, Google, Amazon, etc. And that's going to have potentially a big fallout for luxury goods. We heard at the start of the year that there would be kind of retaliatory measures to the tune of 100% tariffs on luxury goods imports into the US across all European brands and businesses. How's that going to play out in the context of the trade talks being treated separately, or to your point, could it all be scooped up and dealt with, Larry? Do you have a view there?
Well, from what we've been hearing from government sources, I think the UK government very much wants to keep the digital services tax kind of on the table as part of the US-UK trade talks. It's very much what it thinks as a point of leverage against this push by America to have more chlorinated chicken exported to the UK. I think the British government may be a little bit too clever by half on this one, not least because of its own domestic opinion. We've heard from people, at the top of the Labour Party who say that they are, going to be quite vociferous in opposing any moves to water down the digital services tax. If anything, they would quite like to see it applied to content that platforms such as Facebook and YouTube host. So the UK government will have to consider its own domestic opinion as well as what the US is thinking. I think in terms of Biden, and Daniel may be able to kind of shed some more light on this and his attitude to tech, I don't think you're going to get a dramatically different approach to how Biden sees a UK digital services tax vis-a-vis Trump. Yeah. Biden's criticised big tech firms for not paying a lot of tax domestically, but I don't think he's going to, align with the UK government against US tech firms. I just think that wouldn't go down well at all. And there's been plenty of big tech employees who've donated to his campaign who are close to the people around him. I don't see a lot of change in the US's position on that one.
I would agree with that. I would just add that I think that there might be more of a Biden effort to multilateralize the whole question and get a broader sort of international agreement on how to treat tech companies, because country by country is a tricky way to go.
So, one thing maybe to add is that so I agree. I think the UK will not drop this for now. I think there's a broader we're seeing a lot of pressure on national governments and on the public finances. I think there's a sort of pressure to find sources of revenue, which will push a lot of countries to go ahead with national digital services taxes. Obviously, there was a lot of enthusiasm for an OECD solution earlier this year and last year, but I think given the need to support businesses through COVID and the whole society through COVID, like I said, this pressure on public finance will push more than one European country to go ahead with national taxes, which, like Daniel said, kind of increases the risk of double taxation, of regulatory fragmentation, which creates different problems.
Yeah, thank you. Certainly something that all of our members are watching very, very closely, given the potential impact to our businesses and import duties into the US. A couple of questions that have come in. How do you think a Biden win will affect international trade? I think we've slightly covered that already, but anything else to add?
Maybe just to touch on the WTO forum, which I don't think we have. The WTO is in a bit of a sort of limbo situation right now, and if we see a bit more of a constructive approach from a Biden administration as to how to reform the WTO and how to sort of push back against some anti-level playing field practices from some certain countries, I think that might sort of make the difference and get the ball rolling. But right now, I think there's a lot of airing of grievances, but not a lot of solutions being tabled.
Yeah, I think one thing I just add to that about the way Biden and his people think about trade, they've actually done quite a bit of writing on this. I think Jake Sullivan, who is his former national security advisor, and a woman called Jennifer Harris, who worked in the Obama administration, wrote a piece recently in which they said that trade deals in general should be reformed to target tax havens, improve wages, prevent currency manipulation, and perhaps most importantly, generate more investment into the US. So I think it's possible that a Biden administration would seek, requirements around tax and labor investment as part of future deals, and I think we should keep an eye on that, both as the UK and as the business community.
Yeah,
I think they've also said that Biden himself has talked about the future trade agreements have to have a bigger component of labor and environmental standards in them. That very much has to be mindful of the left wing of the Democratic Party in that too, and to some extent those. It would be interesting to see, some of the things that were written into the revised NAFTA with Mexico and Canada perhaps have some of those elements that could help in the future.
Yeah. Thank you. One more question that's come in as well. Let me just quickly read this. Obama went quite heavy last night on Trump's taxes, his Chinese bank account, his relationships with Russia. This would be toxic if it were anybody else. Is sleaze just baked into the Trump share price in the same way as extramarital things are for Boris? Good question.
I think Obama said that that if it had been the other way around, he would have been called Beijing Barry.
Yes, Beijing Barry, yeah.
But I think, you know, there's been so much during the Trump term that would be, you know, huge news and you know, extraordinary. It seemed to be absolutely extraordinary, and now it just washes over a little bit. So we've got a bit, we've got a bit inoculated to all this. I think the outrage factor has become somewhat exhausted. Yeah, so I think it is discounted, and I think at this stage, frankly, it's too late in the game to really influence things on that front.
I think this is one to watch very much in the second term. I think if any of you who've read the New York Times report on his tax returns, you'll have seen that he has a lot of debt that is coming due in the second term. He needs to find cash for his business quite fast, and there've already been reports about, you know, his relationship with countries like Turkey. I do think this question of where he's going to get the money to pay off some of his debts will become a little bit more acute if he wins a second term. I mean, if he doesn't win a second term, he's still got to find the money. It becomes much more a national security issue in a second term.
Terrific, thank you. Well, that's all the questions that have come in. Any final comments that you want to share before we wrap up?
Well, it's going to be a gripping 10 days, as we know. And I think thereafter as well, whoever wins, I think you know, it's going to be America has always been, but remains the preeminent country that influences us all, and it's a dramatic time at the moment. So it's going to be crucial what happens, and absolutely fascinating. Thank you. Perfect way to summarize and end. A huge thank you to Daniel, Larry, Andre. Brilliant session. I've tried to make notes as we're speaking. It's always very difficult to capture everything you're saying, but some brilliant insights and perspectives, and thank you for sharing. I'm going to hand back to Helen now.
Thank you very much, everybody. That's fantastic. I mean, so much to take out of that. I'm kind of encouraged by the idea that Biden might get rid of the tariff dispute. That would be great. But also, the thing that I have learned from this year and from the last 4 years is that the law of sod is absolutely rampant where politics, but everything else is concerned. So, and of course, you know, whatever happens, the world has changed, and whoever wins will preside over an enormously challenging situation domestically as well as geopolitically. So, so thank you very much for those brilliant insights, Daniel, Larry, Andre, and to Charlotte for brilliant moderating. We will be back next Thursday at 4 o'clock with a webinar on diversity and inclusion. Watch the newsletter for that. And thank you very much for listening. Bye-bye. Have a great rest of the day. Bye-bye. Thank you again. Bye.